Prologue. My mom said that when I was born, my chest was still and my eyes were closed. I didn't cry or move. I was silent. She said that everyone thought I had been a stillborn. My mom said she had started crying unrelentlessly. She said the doctors and my dad went to go clean me off anyway, thinking that my chest was riddled with goop. But even after the doctors cleared my body, I was unmoving. The doctors left the room and my dad started crying. He had lost his first girl. But then my older brother came in the room, demanding to see his new sister. My dad tried to stop him from going over to my lifeless body, but my brother wouldn't listen and ran past him. My brother stared at me, mouth agape. He was 10 years old at the time. He grabbed my hand. "She's so pretty, Dad." And then, what my parents would refer to as their miracle, I squeezed my brother's hand. I opened my eyes and yawned heavily as if I had been sleeping for years. He giggled, and my dad, who had been sitting in a chair across the room, ran over, gasping when he saw my open eyes. Such a deep forest green, they almost looked like pieces of moss themselves. My brother and I shared this unspeakable bond with one another, almost as if we were linked from that moment on. My dad yelled for the doctors to come back in, and everyone was astonished that I was alive. Not just alive, but moving and giggling about, as if there had never been an issue to start with. My mom burst into happy tears when she heard the news. All in all, a lot of tears were shed on the day I was born. Relatives on either side would come to gawk at my parents' miracle child. Even though I was just a baby, nothing special about me. Not yet, anyways. The special would come later, after they had passed me off as an ordinary child. Just like any other. But for now, I was simply Alice Gray. Chapter 1. The Funeral. I spent the first several hours of my 12th birthday at a funeral. A relative on my father's side I had never met before. My older brother sat next to me and told me stories of how our great-aunt had been such a lively person before she, died. I snorted loudly, gathering dirty looks from everyone within hearing distance, including my mother and father. I giggled as quiet as possible, the morning air feeling light and cool against my skin. If I could, I would forever be outside. I loved the weather no matter what it was, the temperature changes feeling slight as the seasons passed. I was glad I had a summer birthday, so I was free to be outside as much as I pleased. I sat quietly as the eulogy was delivered, listening to her achievements that had been made over the years. She had lived to be 78. A picture of her was standing outside the coffin. We were outside, and the sky had darkened slightly in a warning of rain. The air was electrified with it. You could breathe in the thick air and feel the mist of the rain against your skin, but not when you're sitting under a tent covering a hole in the ground. The coffin wouldn't even be lowered while we were here, so I failed to see the relevancy. I would think it much easier to have the ceremony at the church, like the body viewing had been. My mind wandered away from what the priest was saying. I was focused on the people crying off to the sides of the tent, their shoulders shaking slightly as they attempted to be as quiet as they could. What was left of the sun by now made the tears shine as it caught them on their cheeks, pointing them out to the world, showing the world their weakness. I tried to never cry. I saw it as a weakness of character. I hadn't even cried when I was a baby. My brother said that was because of him always being near me, making me smile, something he continued to do to this day. Though things had changed drastically since he had left for college. He had broke the news to me softly, telling me it was only a few hours away. My eyes had almost bugged out of my head when he told me that. The one person who seemed always to be able to relate to me was leaving me to go to a school, when he could have gone a mere 20 minutes away from our childhood home. He had left, and it put a strain on our relationship. When apart, I refused to speak to him over the phone, telling him it wasn't the real thing, so I wouldn't torture myself with hearing his comforting voice. Connor understood and tried to visit home as often as possible. He was studying to be a lawyer. I found it amusing, because he was the most unargumentative person I had ever met. So with his constant studying, he still only visited at holidays and under certain circumstances, like a great-aunt's death. But when we saw one another, it was like we had never even been apart, instantly finding that connection again. We were talking constantly, sharing stories of what had been going on in our lives while we had been apart, putting in thoughts and opinions, even when they weren't welcome. We got caught up on each other's lives quickly and thoroughly. He was my best friend. My only friend, really, unless you counted a boy named Ivan that followed me around at school because I stood up for him last semester. But I don't really count that. It wasn't that I don't like people, or that they don't like me. In fact, everyone I met said they felt drawn to me, and I was definitely a people person. I loved to talk, and people were listeners, so we worked in each other's favor. Those things weren't the problem. It was the fact that people became so predictable after a while, me figuring them out and then wanting something new, a challenge to work with. So I went through friends, like some people went through relationships or popsicles on a hot day. And finally, I gave up. Keeping to myself and watching from afar also worked, without the messiness of telling people you no longer cared to be in their presence. My mother and father got plenty of calls from parents complaining I had been rude to their children, saying things like they weren't worthy to be in my presence. I would politely steal the phone from my father's hand and simply explain that it wasn't that they weren't unworthy to be in my presence, but the fact that I no longer found them interesting companions. Telling them that I simply spoke what was on my mind, they would get flustered and begin to yell at me, at which point I would simply hand the phone back to my parents, continuing with whatever activity I had been enjoying before they rudely interrupted me with their complaints. I couldn't connect with people well. I was always looking for something, not really knowing what it was, and I never seemed to find it. I had a goal for my 12th year of life, to discover what that something was, and to then find a friend, and get my family members to stop telling me how strange it was for me to be 12 years old and never have a close friend. Someone to share my every thought with? I found that idea appalling. My thoughts were my own.